Hello everyone. So today I thought I would do just a hopefully fairly quick video and talk about some selkie folklore. I've seen a couple things sort of around on social media specifically getting into selkies, and from a more fiction, fantasy, kind of rewriting things perspective. So I thought it would be helpful to do a video and talk about selkies from the more traditional folkloric standpoint. And selkies are a particularly interesting piece of folklore to me because we find them across a really wide range of cultures. We find selkie stories in Scotland and Ireland, in the Orkneys and the Shetland Isles, even in Iceland. So basically, start at the beginning. What is a selkie? Selkie is actually the word for seal in some of these places, like the Orkneys, for example. It is from an older English word, sell, which means seal. And then the key on the end is sort of a diminutive ending. So selkie, literally seal. The term we find used in Ireland, in the Irish, is roan, which is also just the Irish word for seal. So clearly, this is folklore specifically about seals. In this case, it's about seal people. These are beings that are thought to look like seals when they're in the water, in the ocean, sometimes at the very beginning part of the shore. But they have the ability to take off the seal skin, the fur, and become human in appearance. So the idea is, and again, this is kind of across this folklore, that they, in the ocean, in the water, have the form of seals. And then outside the water, when they come on shore, they take that coat off and they look like humans, like pretty much any human would look. There's nothing in their human appearance that kind of screams selkie. They are generally described as having dark hair and dark eyes, but outside of that, just typical human appearance is what we would be talking about. In the water, they look just like any other seal. So, and this is true, as I said, across sort of the breadth of the folklore. There are occasional slight variations depending on exactly where we're looking at. As I said, this is something that we find across many different cultures. And when we have selkie folklore, roan folklore, usually it comes to us in three main forms, I'll say. The first form is sort of what I would call human neutral, I guess. And these are usually cases, there's particularly, I can think of several Irish examples of this version of a story, where fishermen go out to sea, a big storm comes up, and one of the people on one of the boats who kind of knows a little bit about the other crowd and the out of the ordinary happenings casts a knife into one of the big waves, and the storm immediately disperses and dies down. And then at some point, fairly shortly after that, the person is usually approached by a stranger who asks them to accompany the stranger somewhere. And the person is then taken to, sometimes it's a cave, sometimes it's a home, sometimes it's a grand home, sometimes it's a little cottage. It kind of varies, again, based on who's telling the story and where we're hearing the story from. But the person is taken in and finds a woman in a bed in a bedroom who has been injured. And turns out that the knife that they cast in the wave is now embedded. It's usually either in the leg or torso of this woman, who is in fact a selkie, one of the seal people who had raised the storm against the fishermen. And the person who cast the knife, according to folklore, is the only person who can then remove it. So it becomes this case of, the human person has to decide whether they're going to do that, and kind of go from there. So we see that, examples of that story kind of widespread. We do also see examples on sort of the flip side of that of ships that sink in storms, and then stories of seals, selkies, seal people who help sailors, who keep them from drowning, who bring them safely to shore, that kind of thing. And I describe these as sort of human neutral, even though clearly in the first story the human's not really a neutral party, but because they're sort of brief or unexpected encounters and interactions between the humans and the seal people, and they're sort of one-time encounters for the most part. The second variation that we see with selkie folklore is what I would sort of label the positive amorous human interactions. And these are the cases generally where we're talking about a male selkie and a female human. And again, this is folklore that we find across various different places. The Orkneys and Scotland, I know, have these particular types of stories where you have a woman who's heartbroken, and she goes to the shore, cries 7 tears into the waves, and it's supposed to call or invoke a male selkie to her. These are all the way we have the stories. I don't honestly know if a man could go and cry and get a male selkie, or a female selkie, or a woman could go and cry and get a female selkie. I'm just repeating the stories as we generally have them in the bulk of folklore. Very heteronormative here. Just putting that out there. So the woman goes and cries over her heartbreak, and the male selkie appears. And then in some cases, they sort of have a one-night stand, effectively. In other cases, it becomes a legitimate sort of relationship between the two of them. Sometimes there is a child, sometimes there is not. One of the more famous accounts from Scotland, which I believe is also associated with a song, the woman 7 years later kind of seeks the selkie out again because they have a son together. He ends up taking the son with him back into the water, and they both end up being killed by hunters. It's a very sad story and song. So that's sort of the next iteration that we see. And those are generally positive encounters. There are a few stories and examples where the human woman is taken by the male selkie into the ocean. Sometimes there's a bit of an implication that she's drowned or she dies in order for that to happen. In others, it's just she disappears beneath the waves. We sort of assume that she becomes a selkie or is just, taken by him to go live with him. The third iteration, which is probably the most well-known, sort of famous version of selkie folklore that we have, and again, across the board, we find this everywhere we find selkie stories. Iceland, Ireland, Scotland, the Orkneys, Shetland, everywhere. And this is what I would classify as non-consenting amorous encounters between selkies and humans. In this case, particularly, it's the motif of the selkie wife. So in these stories, generally it's a fisherman is walking on the shore, or for some other reason down on the shore, and he usually sees a group of selkies in their human form, sometimes dancing, sometimes celebrating, sometimes just kind of standing and talking. And he sees all of their seal skins kind of bundled up and off to the side, and manages to sneak over and take one. In some cases, in some of the stories, the selkies see him do this, and they all rush over, grab their seal skins, and flee, except for the one, of course, whose skin has been taken. Selkies cannot return to the sea without their seal skin. That is literally a part of them, but it's also part of their transformation magic. They need that seal skin to take that seal form to go back to the ocean. So without that, they're trapped. So in some cases, it's pretty clear to the selkie that the fisherman has the seal skin, and they are then sort of forcibly obligated to go with this fisherman. In other accounts, the fisherman kind of sneaks away with the seal skin, returns at some later point, and finds this selkie woman sort of crying at the shore because she can't return to the water. She's trapped in human form on land. And in either case, the selkie is then taken by the fisherman in her human form and either forced to become his wife, or, not realizing he is the one who has stolen her seal skin, becomes his wife slightly more voluntarily, but mostly because she has no choice, no other options. In all of the versions of the story, the selkie lives as the human's wife, usually for an amount of time, produces multiple children with him. The number, again, will vary depending on the story. I've heard as few as 3, I've heard as many as 7, so you'll see variations. But one way or another, at some point after this has been going on for years and years, she either finds her seal skin herself, wherever the fisherman had hidden it, or in quite a few of the stories, particularly the Irish stories, one of her children finds it. And if the child finds it, the child then brings it to the mother and says, "Oh, mother, what is this seal skin, or what is this bit of leather that I found, hidden up in the thatch," or whatever. And of course, the way that selkies work, as soon as she has the seal skin back, as soon as it's been recovered, she immediately returns to the ocean. In some of the folklore and some of the stories, she takes her children with her. More common, though, across the bulk of the material that I'm familiar with, she abandons the children. There are some accounts, for example, there's an Icelandic account I was reading this morning, where she starts sort of crying and says, "I have 7 children in the sea, and I have 7 children on land. What do I do?" And then, of course, she goes back into the water, never to be seen or return again. So these are always sort of tragic stories. They're tragic for multiple reasons, of course. You have this woman who is forced into this marriage she didn't want. How non-consensually, again, varies depending on the exact story, but it's never a consensual thing, really. Who is now also being sort of compelled to abandon some of her children. And again, in some cases, like the Icelandic version, we see that she had been forced to abandon her children initially when she was captured, because she couldn't return to the ocean. So now she can return to the children that are in the ocean, but she has to leave behind the children that are on land. So very, very sad stories, this particular aspect of selkie folklore. It's just sort of sad all the way around. There are some scholars who have theorized, based on the descriptions, based on the locations that we find the folklore sort of prevalent in, that they may have originally come from stories about fishermen in these cultures interacting with people from outside cultures, particularly the Sami, or in some cases the Inuit or other indigenous peoples, where the fishermen would find this woman and sort of bring her back. And again, she would sort of be compelled or forced to be a wife, and then at some point would escape and go back to her own people. So I think knowing that kind of adds a layer to understanding or looking at the folklore. Even if that is not true, if that is just an academic supposition that eventually proves to be groundless, which does sometimes happen, the stories themselves, just on their face, are just sad. They're sad stories. These are sort of the 3 variants of selkie folklore that we find. We also find selkie stories in the sense, for example, this comes to us from the Orkney Isles, the idea that children who are born with webbed hands or feet, or born with a particular disorder that made areas of their skin very tough, almost like scales, were said to be children who were descended from selkies. This idea that humans could have this ancestry, and that this ancestry would sort of be passed down and then appear through these very particular deformities associated with, what we might consider like aquatic beings. We also see the idea, I've heard this, a couple variations in some Irish anecdotal accounts and stories of children who have selkie ancestry who would have very dark hair and dark eyes, even when no one else in the family did, sort of that throwback to that selkie connection. Because selkies, of course, are described as having dark hair and dark eyes, like seals. For those of you who've never seen seals, seals are adorable. Seals are also really mean. The best description I think I've ever seen anywhere for a seal is it's basically like a water cat with the morals of a seagull. And that's accurate. I've lived my entire life basically on the shoreline. We have seals here where I live, and then I've seen them, of course, in Ireland. I don't think I saw any when I was in Iceland, but I've seen them several times in Ireland. And that is an accurate description of seals. Selkies are basically seal people. There's also sort of a variant, particularly in the Orkney and Icelandic folklore, called the Finn folk, which is different but related folklore. I'm not going to get too much into that here. I just wanted to talk about selkies today. If you are curious about selkies and want to learn more about selkie folklore, you can find some good sources. Again, I would shy away from fiction that depicts them too far out of what I have talked about in the last 15 minutes of this video. They're generally bound to the ocean. They need their seal skin to transform. It's a part of them, but it can also be, taken off and removed. If they lose it or if it's stolen, they're sort of at the mercy of whoever has it, very unfortunately for them. They can be helpful to humans, but they can also be dangerous. They're known, like I said, to raise storms, as in that first example that I gave. So we have this whole sort of range of ideas. There's a huge amount of selkie folklore out there. As I said, we find this across multiple different cultures, interrelated cultures, but still. And these stories were very popular. There's songs, there's all sorts of stuff that you can find. Just be cautious of anything that's going to be kind of too far out of the range of the stuff I've been talking about, because people do get very creative and kind of take this and try to intentionally change it or twist it. And then you're not looking at folklore, you're looking at just modern fiction, which is a different sort of thing. I will also quickly add another thing that's very common across the folklore with selkies is the idea that, particularly with the selkie brides, but also in other cases, if a person has that connection to a selkie and the selkie returns to the water, they will often have very good fishing or good luck on the water, away with the ocean sort of thing going on. Sometimes the implication is, particularly with the selkie mothers that had to leave their children, that they're continuing to watch over their land-bound children, make sure they're fed by making sure that the fisherman gets a lot of fish, kind of try to take care of them as best they can without being able to leave the water again. You'll also see stories where you'll hear about the selkie following the fisherman's boat looking sad. Seal eyes always look sad. It's just a seal thing. So sometimes the connection isn't immediately broken because the selkie returns to the water, particularly with the children. There seems to be a continuation. Although the clear implication is, even if your mother was a selkie, you yourself cannot turn into a seal or cannot have that ability. They don't ever explain why that is. Like I said, in some of the folklore, the mother will take the children with her. The majority of it she does not. So that's just a point that's not super clear in the folklore. There is a really good movie out there called Song of the Sea, which has selkie folklore in it. I love the movie. I do highly recommend it, but it does get very creative with multiple points, actually. The goddess Macha is in it, and they really just they use her name for a completely different figure, is all I'll say. MacLear, Manana MacLear, again, they use the name completely different figure. And the selkie folklore, they also are a little loose with. So I do think it's a great movie. I do recommend it, but just take it with a grain of salt. It's not an example of accurate selkie folklore. It's more on the creative end. If you want something that's more on the accurate end, there's a movie from the 1990s called The Secret of Roninish, which is actually based on an older book, I believe from Scotland or set in Scotland. The Secret of Ronskeri, I think, is what it's called. I haven't read it, so I honestly don't remember what exactly the title is. It's easy to search. Either way, The Secret of Roninish, the movie, set in Ireland, and it has a lot of selkie folklore in it, Roan folklore in this case specifically, but it covers a lot of the things that I've kind of just touched on in this video. The idea of them rescuing sailors in danger on the water, the idea of the mother who the sealskin is stolen, and then when she recovers it, she has to leave and abandons the children. The idea of these children who still have this connection to the seals and to the water and to these seal people, these otherworldly beings. So that is a movie I highly recommend. It's really well done and surprisingly very accurate on the folklore end. I can't think offhand of any books that I'm familiar with that are about selkies or that have sort of really accurate selkie folklore going on, but you can certainly find anecdotal accounts and the actual folklore stories out there floating around, and I know there's some on YouTube, particularly Scottish storytellers that have recorded different selkie stories. There are also, like I said, several songs that deal specifically with selkies, traditional songs. There's just an abundance of this material to be found. But important things to remember, sort of our crash course in selkies here, is much like all otherworldly beings, they can be positive, they can be negative. They're sort of basically just trying to do their own thing, kind of like actual seals. Mostly avoid humans, except for when they sort of voluntarily choose to interact. And of course, as I mentioned, there is the folklore, particularly with male selkies, the idea of crying into the water, sort of invoking them, and then the selkie one night stand. And then the bulk of it is on that sort of sadder end. Other than that, I think we've kind of touched on everything that I can think of that would be important to mention about selkies. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the comments, and I will be happy to answer them or address them. I think we've covered everything you could need to know about selkies going forward. And, sort of feel free to use this as a measure when you run across stories about selkies or information about selkies. This is kind of the baseline for them. You can sort of judge the quality of something based on how close it adheres to sort of everything I've been talking about in the last 20 minutes. If it's too far away from all of this, it's probably a little dodgy. If it's pretty close to any version of everything I've been saying, then it's probably pretty accurate to the folklore. And people, of course, do continue to have these encounters, and these stories continue today. This is not just something from the past. Seals, anywhere you're on a coastline and there's seals, you're going to find some kind of selkie story or some version of seal people stories. But particularly, like I said, Iceland, the Orkneys, the Shetland Isles, Ireland, Scotland, we have an abundance of this material. So that's all I can think of to say about selkies. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will try to make another one at some point fairly soon. Pop your questions in the comments, and I will get to them when I have a chance. Slán go fóill.